right, Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, if outright lies are a sign of a movement in desperation, then the pro-Zionist movement might be cooked. As you know, for months, the media has been working in overdrive to downplay atrocities committed by Israel against Palestinians, while credulously endorsing unsubstantiated and since disproven stories about, say, 40 beheaded babies, mass rapes on October 7th, and Hamas headquarters under now destroyed hospitals. A leaked New York Times internal memo revealed that journalists are discouraged from using the words genocide, ethnic cleansing, occupied territory, refugee camps, or even the word Palestine at the New York Times. And a quantitative analysis by The Intercept conducted back in January showed that Palestinians were mentioned less in the news the more the death toll mounted. And words like slaughter and massacre were used 60 times more when referring to Israelis versus Palestinians, even as the Palestinian death toll reached tens of thousands. New reporting from E. Alex Jung in the New York Magazine details how the ADL's Jonathan Greenblatt openly lobbied MSNBC for more pro-Israel coverage, saying right on Morning Joe, out in the open, who was writing the scripts? Hamas? And he was successful. As one employee told Jung, everyone put the screws to NBC and MSNBC to change the tenor of our coverage. Another employee told him that around October 7th, context was not welcome. Context was a bad word. Empathy for Palestinians felt forbidden inside MSNBC. Yet despite these feats of media engineering, the public still overwhelmingly supports a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and conditioning military aid to Israel, even if Biden doesn't. This media battle may in part have motivated the TikTok ban, which successfully passed the Senate yesterday. All that's left now is for Biden to sign it into law. Authoritarianism isn't something to fear if Trump is reelected. It's already here. Biden and Trump, establishment Democrats and Republicans alike, have backed the ban, and they're not being discreet about why they're so fond of it. Take a listen to NYU professor Scott Galloway blaming pro-Palestine protests on TikTok.
What might sound paranoid doesn't mean I'm wrong. I think we are being manipulated, specifically youth, who their frame for the world is TikTok. And if you look at TikTok, there are 52 videos that are pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian for every one served on Israel. I think that we are being manipulated. I think Americans are easier to fool than convinced they've been fooled. But if I were the CCP, I'd be doing exactly the same thing.
He's not the only one. Fox News hosted a TikTok star with 1 million followers who, ostensibly against his own interest, also supports a ban because Hamas.
You really have seen since October 7th, especially, the algorithm seems to have taken a bit of an ominous turn. I mean, you're really seeing Gen Z become Gen T, Gen terrorism. And I say that not just as a joke, but as a reality.
Of course, that is not reality. Gen Z doesn't support terrorism or Osama bin Laden, as he later claims in that clip. But social media did allow Osama bin Laden's 2001 Why I Did It letter to finally be read widely, decades after it had been suppressed by Western media. And folks too young to remember 9/11 learned what many of us who were old enough to know better had forgotten or buried. That bin Laden cited U.S. support for, quote, the oppressive Israelis and their occupation of our Palestine as a motive for the 9/11 attacks. The kids aren't supporting Osama bin Laden. Rather, they're wisely asking whether, 2 decades and several forever wars later, Palestinian statehood would have been a quicker path to peace than a war on terror. The TikTok influencer called Gen T for terrorists, but the terrorism that's motivating Gen Z and the majority of Americans isn't conducted by Hamas. They're motivated by the gruesome images of slain, starving, and injured Palestinians, the 13,000 murdered children, flattened schools, a father collecting pieces of his children in a plastic bag, images that have become ubiquitous on TikTok. These images are shared not because China wants it to be so, but because moral hearts feel compelled to share them as part of an appeal to make it stop. But in the face of a clear American consensus that the siege must end, the American state only has one response: authoritarianism. The House censured Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American in Congress, for demanding freedom for Palestine from the river to the sea. Congress passed a resolution defining anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. According to our government, to criticize a foreign government is tantamount to a hate crime. The Biden administration has engaged in Orwellian doublespeak, claiming it supports a two-state solution, while just days ago it vetoed a resolution blocking full UN membership for Palestine, a place so taboo, remember, that the New York Times recommends not referring to Palestine at all. And now for one of the greatest disappearing tricks in the history of modern media, an explosive story about mass graves filled with hundreds of Palestinians is being, ironically, buried under a mountain of coverage about student protests at elite universities. It took nearly a week for the mainstream media to finally report on this story. More than 300 bodies pulled from a mass grave in the southern city of Khan Yunis. Local authorities report and photographs corroborate that some of the bodies were found with bound hands and feet, indicating possible field executions, or people who may have been buried alive. One handcuffed corpse, whose picture circulated widely on social media, was wearing scrubs, raising questions as to whether he was a slaughtered medical professional. When questioned by the New York Times about whether Israeli forces killed and buried these victims, Israel declined to address the claims. A top UN official yesterday called for an inquiry into the mass graves, but if you're wondering what our own government has to say about it, well, take a listen.
On Saturday, Palestinian civil defense crews have uncovered a mass grave with 180 people, including women, men, and children, that Israel had basically killed those people. That's what they're saying. Are you aware of the report, and do you have any comment on it?
I've seen those reports, and we are inquiring about it with the government of Israel.
Will the U.S. press the Israelis to find out more about this issue?
That's exactly what we're doing.
Don't worry, they're inquiring about it. Note that I had to scroll past no fewer than 4 articles about Ivy League campus protests to finally reach the mass grave story at the New York Times. It seems that just like the TikTok ban, congressional censorship, and style guides that ban legally accurate terms like occupation, the strategy here seems to be to simply hide the ball, downplay atrocities, and sometimes to outright lie. Now, here, talk about a false flag, literally. For about a week, right-leaning establishment media, including Fox News, the New York Post, and Daily Mail, along with outlets like the Daily Caller and the Washington Examiner, ran with incendiary headlines about a physical attack on a Jewish student. As these outlets ignored and downplayed mass graves in Gaza, their headlines rang out, quote, "Jewish Yale student stabbed in the eye. Peers joined the Nazi party. Cops at Yale arrest violent anti-Israel protesters after Jewish student journalist stabbed in the eye. Jewish student jabbed in eye with Palestinian flagpole while reporting on protest. Mob behavior," qualified Fox News. But after days of this coverage, days during which this incident was used to justify the mass arrest, suspension, and expulsion of students around the country, the truth has come out in the form of a video. Now, we weren't able to get permission to play the video here in time for this segment, but if you saw or get to see it, it was a blink and you'd miss it moment. As it turns out, the flagpole in question was a tiny handheld flag that apparently touched the victim's face as protesters walked by in a packed crowd. But look at how the anti-Palestinian movement rallied around this victim. Embracing a false victim narrative, libs of TikTok Chaya Ratchik tweeted on Monday, "A Jewish student was stabbed in the eye at Yale and a bunch of terrorist sympathizers are now running Columbia." The 300,000 follower Twitter account run by the Stop Anti-Semitism group put a hit out on the flag bearer, asking folks to identify him and, quote, "help secure his arrest. Enough is enough." Barry Weiss, never far from moments like these, gave the victim space to write her own op-ed on Barry Weiss's very popular Substack, The Free Press. The Free Press. Freedom, apparently, is weaponizing false victimhood to call for the arrest of peaceful protesters. Who knew? The free speech grift has been thoroughly exposed by Gaza. With hundreds of students participating in protests at Columbia, there have been almost no documented instances of anti-Semitism or violence by Columbia University students on Columbia University property. Thin anti-Semitism on campus stories are fleshed out with ominous descriptions of normal occurrences. Take a new John McWhorter op-ed, one of the 4 campus protest pieces I had to scroll through to get to the mass grave story in the New York Times. In it, McWhorter writes, "The other night, I watched a dad coming home from the protest with his little girl, giving a good hard few final snaps on the drum he was carrying, nodding at her in crisp salute, percussing his perspective into her little mind. This is not peaceful." What? A father and his child protesting a genocide while playing the drums isn't peaceful? Or take this post by English media personality Ollie London, in which he describes a joyful interfaith dance as a, quote, cult-like tribal dance while dancing and clapping to Arabic music. To drum up the evidence needed to justify exerting state violence against anti-war protesters, anti-Palestinian news outlets have trained their lens on the streets of New York, outside Columbia's gates, in an effort to paint peaceful interfaith demonstrations like the beautiful, beautiful Passover Seders of the last couple of nights as violent and anti-Semitic, ignoring even mainstream reporters like NBC's Antonia Hilton, who tweeted that her team, quote, spent long hours reporting on and around Columbia's campus on Thursday and Friday and didn't see a single instance of violence or aggression on the lawn or at the student encampment. And hearteningly, even though Columbia students are not responsible for the couple of outlier instances of inappropriate or outright anti-Semitic signage or chanting, they have been quick to condemn those actions. And why wouldn't they? They're not anti-Semitic. This is an interfaith movement that has been co-led by Jewish students and Jewish groups like Jewish Voices for Peace and Not in Our Name from the beginning. Despite the media's framing of these protests as against Jewish students, it's largely Jewish students who have been arrested in droves, hauled off in zip ties, rounded up, and expelled from university, targeted by authoritarian Christian conservatives like Tom Cotton, who was calling for the National Guard to put them down. As Jewish protesters bear a disproportionate share of state violence alongside Arab and Muslim activists who have been bearing the brunt of these attacks, I can't help but recall the Kent State Massacre, during which Nixon sent the National Guard to put down Vietnam protesters. As a consequence, 4 students were killed, 3 of them Jewish. Sandra Schuer, aged 20, Jeffrey Miller, aged 20, Allison Krauss, aged 19. I humbly submit that those students who died protesting a vicious war were genuine victims. Compare them to the students demanding safety today as they antagonize peaceful pro-Palestine protesters and demand that forces of the state haul them off to prison. As always, this isn't a right-left dynamic, it's a top-down one, where billionaires like Patriots owner Robert Kraft, Bill Ackman, and Elon Musk are all aligned with the war machine. Multi-billion-dollar university endowments are literally invested in weapons manufacturing. Congress members are calling for the National Guard and censoring their colleagues for criticizing a foreign country. The Supreme Court is turning a blind eye as 3 states imperil the right to protest at all. America is entering one of its most dangerous, most authoritarian, most fascistic moments. And I have to point out, it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. This is a big which side are you on moment for the country. It could be a moment of unity, with the people demonstrating solidarity against a political and media class that wants to thrust us into global conflict and make us pay for the mass murder of civilians. What will happen remains to be seen. Will people power force the powerful to submit to us for once? Can the people resist as moneyed elites threaten to pull their funds and threaten us with arrest, with doxing, or even threaten us financially if we don't comply with their ideology? Or will we side with state power, the National Guard, the Kent State troops who put down Vietnam protesters, the elites in Congress who just cleared a $95 billion aid package for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan? Indeed, which side are you on?
Let me ask you this. You seem to think that the protests are being overcovered and the incident, the atrocities, the mass graves are being undercovered. Is that not an argument against, on practical, technical grounds, the kind of protests that are going on college campuses if they are providing a distraction, if they are refocusing the media toward their antics? Isn't that an argument for not doing exactly what they're doing?
If I thought the absence of the student protests would provoke deeper coverage of the mass graves, that would be a good argument. But we've seen various distraction techniques being exploited by the media for over 6 months now that have justified, enabled it to avoid reporting on some of the most egregious, violent atrocities that have occurred in Gaza. And to the enormous credit of the students, they have constantly and consistently reframed their efforts to not being about themselves. They tell people, don't stand in solidarity with us, don't complain about us getting arrested, focus on what we're fighting for, which is for our multi-million, billion-dollar organizations, universities, to divest from weapons manufacturers, intelligence systems that are directly contributing to what the ICJ has described as a plausible genocide in Gaza. So to the extent that the media is choosing not to report on mass graves and choosing instead to try to reframe this issue.
I mean, they are reporting on them. I looked at mass graves, New York Times, CNN, our own website.
That's the point that I made. This story from over the weekend took literally days to appear for the first time yesterday. I believe the story broke. There was a mass grave story from 2 weeks ago, and there was the most recent one that I think broke on Friday or Saturday. And the whole weekend, multiple stories about what a handful of students at elite, in the grand scheme of America, at elite colleges are doing. Not even covering the protests that are happening at less elite colleges, like in Minnesota and other parts of the country that are equally important and whose students actually have, I think, a lot more at risk because they don't come from as Tony background as many of the students at Columbia University do. And they have chosen to focus on that. And buried way down on the page, if you go, I don't know what it looks like now, but yesterday, I had to literally scroll by 2 op-eds, a Bret Stephens op-ed, I believe, and the John McWhorter op-ed, in addition to 2 other reported stories about the protests, before I got to one short story.
No, I know. These things always get a lot of coverage. I mean, that's been true. Every time there's a kerfuffle on campus, it gets overcovered. The media has a enduring appetite for these kinds of stories, and it is obviously the case that the viewers and readers of elite media also have an appetite for what's going on in elite spaces. So I guess I would just say, if the protesters are trying to refocus, I worry that the Palestinian cause is afflicted with some of the least sympathetic kinds of protesters of any cause on earth. But
I think the TikTok ban suggests otherwise. I think the polls showing large and growing sympathy for Palestine suggest otherwise. And in fact, the movement that is really flailing right now is the one that has to make a national media story out of a girl who had a flag brush by her eye as the symbol of campus victimization of Jewish students, while at the same time ignoring the real assaults on Jewish students who are protesting in favor of Palestinian human rights that are not coming from a protester that got nudged or brushed with the flag during an on-campus debate by another young person, but by the arm of the state being called in to round up, arrest, zip tie, and haul away Jewish students.
I didn't say anything about in any of our commentary on the campus stuff because I hadn't been able to look closely enough at that, and I thought it might be an accidental kind of thing, and so I didn't say anything about it. I've focused my criticism of the protesters on the chain of protesters on the campus who tried to eject what they described as Zionist students from their midst, and the person who was having calling on Hamas to get these people, and that was on campus. I do agree that most of the and this is not controversial because even people who are very supportive of these protests, like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, have said the same thing, that most of the people causing most of the genuine mayhem are outside interlopers trying to get in, which is the case at all of these kinds of protests. So
Yeah.
All right, we've talked about this for a while, so we'll have more Rising right after this.